So you might remember that earlier this summer, the founders to Unknown Worlds, which is the studio behind Subnautica, were all fired by their publisher, Krafton. The founders, that being Charlie Cleveland, Max Mcguire, and Ted Gill, argued that Krafton did this to avoid paying out a $250 million bonus that had been promised to them and then proceeded to sue Krafton. Now, since my last video on this situation, there has been a pretty big development in this case between Krafton and the founders. But before we dive headfirst into that, I just want to remind you guys that if you head on over to my Patreon, you'll find exclusive content only accessible to Patreon supporters, which is available to patrons who pledge $5 a month and above. Link is down in the pinned comment below. Now, since the legal battle started this summer, there has been a ton of dirty laundry aired between both the founders and Krafton, but the most recent development is probably the most important so far, and it's described as a seismic shift in the case. Now, to get a full perspective on this, let's go ahead and check out the latest document about the case, which is a complaint or a lawsuit from Krafton's side, because this is where we get that seismic shift in the case. That said, this is the public redacted version of this document, and you'll find out soon enough why exactly this was redacted in the first place. So the document starts off recapping pretty much Krafton's side of things and their position since the case started, such as their claim that Charlie, Max, and Ted pocketed most of the $500 million Krafton purchased Unknown Worlds for, and that Krafton and the founders had agreed that the founders would actively be working on the game. Now, this new information starts at point 5 here, and apologies for the legal mumbo jumbo. I'll try to translate it as best as I can as I'm reading, so bear with me, okay? So point 5 says all 3 key employees, that being Charlie, Max, and Ted, remained both officers and directors of the company to see these projects through, which is both Subnautica 2 and Moonbreaker they're talking about here. Indeed, in addition to their fiduciary duties of care and loyalty as officers and directors, the key employees made fundamental commitments to Unknown Worlds, including to devote substantially all of their business time and efforts to the company. In connection with the EPA, they also executed employment agreements in which they committed to specific roles and duties with the company, promised to not use or disclose Unknown Worlds confidential information, and as you can see here, I have marked this sentence, agreed to promptly return any confidential information and company property upon their termination or Unknown Worlds request, and promised not to retain devices containing Unknown Worlds confidential information after termination. So what they're essentially saying here is that Max, Charlie, and Ted had agreed that should they be terminated or be let go or any, such matter, they would return any confidential information that would belong to Unknown Worlds. This, again, this is what Krafton's side of things are. We'll get to that a little bit more later when it comes to evidence and stuff like that, but right now this is the story they are going with. Point 6 continues with, but the bright future the parties anticipated in 2021 was not to be. This lawsuit arises because the key employees, despite their roles as officers and directors, largely abandoned the company, the Subnautica game, and the gaming community that has been anticipating new adventures in the sequel Subnautica 2. Compounding this abandonment, each of the 3 key employees downloaded substantial volumes of company confidential information on their way out the door. Unknown Worlds brings this lawsuit to recover damages for the injuries caused by the key employees' abandonment and breach of their fiduciary duties to the company, to put Krafton and Unknown Worlds in the position they would be in if the key employees had not breached their contractual obligations, and to recover and protect the company's confidential and proprietary information. Point 6 says continuity in Unknown Worlds leadership was central to the transaction, yet rather than devote their time and efforts to Subnautica 2's release, at least 2 of the key employees checked out in all but name. Cleveland was the first to stray, despite publicly holding himself out as the chief executive officer and game director of Unknown Worlds. He was gradually becoming disengaged. In 2022, the lead developer on Subnautica 2, a franchise and project supposed to be led by Cleveland, openly complained that the project had no creative leadership, and I haven't been able to get much of Charlie's time lately and sort of don't know what he really thinks or wants to hear, which is a quote. By 2023, Cleveland announced to friends and some colleagues that he was leaving video game development to learn how to produce movies and explore other interests. He later changed his LinkedIn profile to part-time, and by 2024, he abandoned all creative or other leadership roles with the company. Technical lead Mcguire spent 2022 and 2023 buried in the passion project of a new game, Moonbreaker, even well past the time that it became clear that Moonbreaker was a commercial failure. Now, what I find very interesting in this story here, I just want to take a break here between all of the mumbo jumbo, is that it seems like Krafton doesn't really care about Moonbreaker. What I find is interesting is that even if the game was a commercial failure at launch, I do still find it respectable that Mcguire still kept working on the game and tried to make it better. I mean, wouldn't you want a game that you published to get better? I don't really get their point. What they're trying to bring here is that just because it's a commercial failure doesn't mean you should abandon it. So it's like, this isn't painting Krafton in a better light. It's just, I find it interesting that they would bring this up as an argument. Like, why does that matter? Now, on point 9, though, I want to go back to their original story, what Krafton kept repeating over and over again before. Gill could not overcome the complete abdication of the Subnautica 2 creative and technical leadership team between 2023 and 2025 as key employees Cleveland and Mcguire pursued other projects. Development in Subnautica 2 stalled. The release date, initially projected for yada yada yada, was pushed back again and again 3 times in all because the game was nowhere near release. Worse, the scope of the projected release was degraded time and time again. What originally was projected to be a limited scope early access release was limited to little more than a sandbox. The introductory narrative that would sell Subnautica fans on the sequel was scaled back. Now, just to make it clear here, the sole focus of Krafton so far has been that the founders, Charlie, Ted, and Max, were all fired because they were trying to get the game out as early as possible, that it wasn't ready, and that's why they fired them. Meanwhile, of course, the founders are on the side of that they fired us because we wanted our $250 million and they didn't want to pay it out. And so that has been like the main point all this time, right? And now Krafton here repeats a lot of the stuff they talked about before, and explaining their mindset of how important it would be to improve on a sequel, and that even if it's early access, they would still have to improve on the early access and have more content because it's a sequel, and otherwise it would damage the company's reputation, and yada yada yada, stuff that they've talked about before. On point 13, they go back to essentially, mudslinging again. While ignoring their duties to the company and their fans, the key employees nonetheless found time to focus on their own self-interest, namely to strategize over their potential earnout payment under the EPA. They're trying to say here that Charlie, Max, and Ted were like,
how can we get this payout, yo?
Conversations about the earnout started immediately with the key employees and other potential beneficiaries concerned that development and release windows did not map to the revenue they needed to maximize their income. But never fear, one developer wrote to Mcguire, I do think Ted will concoct a scheme to get us that earnout. And now further down the document, we can actually see chat messages sent between various developers and Max and Ted and Cleveland, of course, where we see what seems to be evidence of them talking about how to make certain things happen, but none of it, I think, paints them in the light that they were like super focused on just getting the payout. If anything, it seems like they were obviously concerned in trying to get out the early access, but they still wanted that earnout that they had been promised by Krafton if they could get it out. And so to me, a lot of the chats between the various people that we see further down doesn't give me the idea that they were just after the payout, more that it was just a concern of how do we make this work. I'll go into that a little bit more later, but for now, let's try to stick to the point here, and that's the story is essentially changing from Krafton's side. Now, continuing here on point 14, and concoct a scheme the key employees ultimately did. Having previously allowed the development schedule for Subnautica 2 to erode, with the earnout window closing, the key employees realized that the pre-order demand and franchise value of Subnautica 2 presented their best opportunity to spike short-term sales, even if it meant harming the franchise long-term. Driven by self-interest and contrary to the best interest of Unknown Worlds, the key employees resolved to publish whatever they could under the Subnautica 2 name on a timeline that didn't tank the earnout opportunity. So they pushed to release Subnautica 2 before the earnout period expired, and they did so even amidst internal and playtest feedback that the game was a and likely to Now, as you may have seen here on point 14, I think it's pretty obvious that Krafton is trying really hard to paint these guys as greedy assholes. It's like, it's almost like reading a little bit of a fanfic here. It's like, oh,
these guys are so evil and so greedy, you have no idea.
Here's the thing, right? And this is something that we'll come back to later again. They're getting desperate. This smells very desperate to me. And I'm not trying really here to take Charlie and the others' side. I'm trying to stay impartial, but this to me just gives me this idea that Krafton, they don't really know where they're going to go right now. They're trying to grab onto anything they can to win this case, and we'll get back to that later. But for now, just, something sticks. So, continuing, the company's interest and the key employees' personal interest collided in late spring 2025. In late May and then again in early June 2025, the key employees met with the company's owner and the game's intended publisher, Krafton, to discuss a Subnautica 2 release. The key employees were aware that the current development fell far short of the company's internally set expectations for the early access release. You might remember that there was a couple of leaked images that came supposedly from Krafton, which, suspiciously coincided with the firings of Charlie, Max, and Ted. It was really strange, and that also makes it that much more difficult to believe Krafton's, their side, because somebody from Krafton leaked images they shouldn't have to push their narrative. Therein the problem. Nonetheless, at those meetings, key employees demanded that the not yet ready game be released at once. When Krafton refused to publish the game before it was ready, the key employees openly threatened Krafton with the litigation, expressly demanding and prioritizing a release date for Subnautica 2 that would allow them to capture of Subnautica 2's revenue toward the Earnout target. Put simply, the key employees announced their priorities. They demanded the Earnout, not the early access release that would best entice the gaming community into the Subnautica 2 world. Personal, not company goals were the priority for the key employees. When Krafton held firm, the key employees came up with a different plan. They threatened to self-publish Subnautica 2, releasing it without Krafton's backing, marketing, promotion, or distribution. Self-publication would generate some revenue serving the key employees' personal goals, but it risked failing to deliver the success necessary to sustain and build the franchise. So, too, self-publication would send mixed and concerning signals to the active Subnautica community, concerns that would be reinforced by a subpar release. Once the key employee scheme of prioritizing the Earnout over game development and goodwill materialized, Unknown Worlds was left with no choice but to terminate their employment. On June 19th, 2025, the key employees were informed that if they continued to insist on the premature release of Subnautica 2, the company would take all actions necessary to prevent inevitable and reversible harm, which included termination. Now here comes their big claim. Okay, hold your hats, this is a big one. While these threats of litigation and self-publication were pending, the key employees began to remove company confidential information to their personal devices. Gill exported his entire Unknown Worlds email account on June 2nd, 2025, and again on June 30. Mcguire and Cleveland grew more active in the week before their threatened termination. Mcguire downloaded 99,902 company files in the days leading up to his termination, and Cleveland downloaded 72,140 company files. Cleveland was stopped in the middle of his activity. His last download from the company's system occurred just 8 minutes before the company terminated his system access. These downloads were by far the largest downloads for each of the three key employees at any time since at least 2022. The key employees' downloads included company confidential information of nearly every type, business records, game intellectual property, and communications from within the company. The termination was not a clean break. Unknown Worlds requested as a standard that the key employees return or provide any devices containing confidential information for inspection, or at least very least confirm that confirmational information is in their possession. The key employees refused. Instead, upon information believed, they retained those files. When pushed, the key employees threatened to delete files and again refused to provide access to their devices containing confidential information for inspection. So, again, to make it perfectly clear here, what Krafton is saying is essentially that they didn't actually fire Charles, Max, and Ted because the game was getting pushed out too early. It was actually because they were copying a bunch of files and that they were threatening to self-publish Subnautica 2. That seems to be what their main cause is here, like a reading between the lines, that they're saying essentially that they had threatened Krafton that they would self-publish Subnautica 2 and that this was like the actual reason. Now, the problem with all of this is that this is getting settled in the Delaware court. And if you don't know the Delaware court, they're like the most hard-ass, hardline courts in the world. They handle big corporation cases such as this, and they want facts. They want clarity. So here's the problem. Krafton is not providing a clear reason for why they fired the three guys. It's like, okay, did you do it because of this or this? Like, what are you trying to say here? They're sending mixed messages. The thing is, very interestingly enough, this was one of those cases where the judge herself was confused, and she actually proceeded, or the court proceeded to dismiss the case entirely. So that's why this is redacted, because they didn't have, like, they couldn't provide anything with this new stuff, essentially. Like, they tried to bring a new lawsuit into this, but they didn't, like, respond really to the case at hand. They essentially just tried to start something new and, like, give a different reason. So it's like this entire situation is so confused right now, and even like the court and the judge was confused. Now the defendants, that being Fortis, or the team that is representing Charlie, Max, and Ted, responded to this, and in an article from gamesindustry.biz, there's a quote here saying, "Krafton's disorganized retreat raises more questions than answers. To say Krafton's new theory is a Hail Mary would be an understatement, both because the downloads were not wrongful and because Krafton claims not to have learned of them until after it had fired the founders. The downloads cannot have been the actual motivation for termination." And on PC Gamer, we find some more, context to this, to what the response from the team was, and from the judge itself. Fortis called it a seismic shift in the case and a little bit bewildering. This was also echoed by the judge herself, Lori W. Will, when the parties met for a ruling on the filed motion, saying, "Well, that's something that we definitely need to get to the bottom of today, because that is precisely what was cited as the reason in the answer." That reason being that they were essentially saying that Charlie, Max, and Ted were trying to push out the game before it was ready. That's why they were fired, not this. So they're changing their motivation. Now, this is pretty telling of how Krafton is thinking right now. They're obviously very desperate. They're trying to find any way whatsoever, any angle they can to somewhat like win this case. And I kind of want to talk about that for a moment here, because the problem isn't necessarily the $250 million, right? Because Krafton is a billion-dollar company. Like, they could possibly go through with a $250 million payout. Like, it would hurt, absolutely. It would hurt some of their financials, but they would be okay in the long run. The problem is that they're now in a situation where if they lose the case, they're not just going to lose $250 million. They're going to lose $250 million plus damages, because that is what Charlie, Max, and Ted are, like, what they want out of this case. They're going to suffer fees, but worst of all, they're going to suffer their reputation being in the stinker forever. This is a huge thing. Like, this is a huge, like, dirty laundry situation where a lot of us, like, are watching from the sidelines. And whenever the winner, like, whenever somebody comes out of this as a winner, even if they settle with Max, Charlie, and Ted, that's still going to be considered a loss, because that means that they were doing something that isn't entirely right. Let's say they were working behind the scenes to like, control the narrative and stuff like that. This is going to dirty their reputation so much that a lot of other studios and publishers are not going to want to work with them. Players are going to be like, anything by Krafton, ugh, And I know a lot of you are probably already like that, but this situation is going to be unresolvable if they lose. And losing means even settling. So in order for Krafton to win this, they need to be able to absolutely prove that Charlie, Max, and Ted are as bad and evil as they're trying to portray them as. So it's like, okay, like, that is the only way they can come out of this. Even if, let's say that Charlie, Max, and Ted aren't considered like angels, you could say that some of their activities would be like selfish, or that they would have abandoned Subnautica to whatever line of thought you're on, you might be right, but it doesn't matter, because Krafton has fucked up so hard since the beginning of this. Like, that leak was probably the worst thing that could have happened, because they think that actually helped them out community-wise, and that it would like help their image. And I'll admit I was very close to be like, yeah, I'm starting to go. But then I realized that, damn, this is so suspect, the entire situation, how hard they're trying to control the narrative. And obviously that's what you want to do. You want to control the narrative when stuff like this happens. But it's so evident what they're doing that it's really hard to believe them and really hard to take their side because they're trying everything they can. Meanwhile, Charlie, Max, and Ted, they still they have the same reasoning the entire time. They just say, they didn't want to pay out the $250 million. That's it. That's the reason why we were fired. That's their single line. And so far, it's been working. So far, Charlie, Max, and Ted are winning because Krafton cannot give a good reason. They can't portray a good enough defense. Again, it's up in the air. We still don't exactly know how this is going to pan out. I do want to mention also something that makes me go, really, and that's something in the document itself. When you scroll down to what is it, point 106, 105, they say this stuff. For anybody who was who are in on the situation and about what happened back, during the summer. The file says this: the Subnautica fan community backs Unknown World's decision. Oh boy, video game franchises tend to build large communities of interested gamers, and the level of success of any particular game can depend directly on the views expressed in those communities. Subnautica's gaming communities gather in various places, the largest of which is Reddit, an independent online message board, and specifically in a subreddit dedicated to the Subnautica game franchise. The community also congregates on Steam, a third-person platform that distributes streaming games and allows users to comment in various communities. The Reddit and Steam communities are monitored by the company, so they're keeping a watchful eye. 106, the Subnautica community's reaction to the key employee's termination was overwhelmingly positive. What reality are you living in, Krafton? That's the opposite of what happened. Anyway, unsurprisingly, most fans cared about what was best for the Subnautica franchise, not what was best for the key employees' finances. The near universal community reaction was summed up by one fan's post on Reddit, July 15th, 2025. That bonus was supposed to be an incentive to put effort into the game. Instead, they hired smart people to handle it for them and then left. The post continued. This is defending the game, not the XX, because those three were literally not involved in it in any way. And then they, provide some screenshots here and there about people defending Krafton's side and taking Krafton's side. And hey, fair is fair. All is fair. If you think that they are being more truthful and that Charlie, Max, and Ted are the people in the wrong here, that's fine. But let's not get reality twisted here. What Krafton is trying to spin is that the community was in their favor. It was not, let me tell you. I mean, just look at my YouTube comments. Just look at the very day that Charlie uploaded that post on Reddit where he talked about what happened. The community was absolutely, for the most part, on Charlie, Max, and Ted's side. Most of the time they were. There have been people going over and being like, yeah, but Krafton makes a strong case here, but let's not get it twisted. This is pretty much a bold-faced lie. This was not the case. The community was not rallying behind Krafton. They were rallying behind the original founders. So this is just a side note, but this makes their case even worse in my eyes because they're trying to twist the narrative when it's absolutely not the case. Again, the Delaware court has some pretty smart people, and I don't think that the judge is dumb enough to believe this, because this was not the case at all. I just want to bring this up, and this entire thing, this makes Krafton's side worse. It just does, because they're literally lying about the situation. That was not how it was. Anyway, there's tons more in this document that I could be talking about, but my voice is getting raspy. I'm getting tired. I've been reading this goddamn document ever since a couple of days ago, so I've been trying to learn as much as I can, but I'll keep reporting on this whenever we get something substantial, as I promised before. Again, guys, let me know what you think about the situation so far in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my Patreon, where I goof off with my girlfriend and, upload exclusive content. Anyway, take care, guys. Mr. Olton, signing off.